All right, it looks like we are now live for the December. Oh, there we go. Now I'm seeing the live button. We're live for the philosophy pop-up for December. Thought I'd have a little bit of a different backdrop this time, although I'm not going to stand here holding the laptop this entire time. So you see the city of Milwaukee behind me. We finally have some snow. It's about time. By this time, when I was a kid, we could cross-country ski pretty much everywhere, but there's not a hell of a lot of snow, and it's not, as you can see, sticking all that well, unfortunately. So this is our view from our one window in our apartment. It's kind of a nice early in morning and evening as the sun is rising and setting, and we get the buildings behind us. So I figured I would just chat a little bit while everybody piles in. It's still a minute before we're officially supposed to begin. And I think everything is set up properly with the live control room and all of that business. If not, then I'm not able to. Here we go. December pop-up. There we go. So let's see how this works. Should be seeing. Good. I see somebody live chatting in already. Hello, Efe. If I'm not mispronouncing your name. All right. So now I'm going to actually sit down because there's no way I'm holding that laptop in my arms all day long. Today, the philosophy pop-up, we're going to talk about sort of a holiday theme, philosophy in general, and what it has to tell us about festivals and holidays. So there's a lot of room for discussion, I think, a lot of interesting topics. I had in mind to talk about, and I'm just going to touch on them. You know, people can always ask me questions and we can go into more detail about this. I was going to talk about Plato, maybe touch on Aristotle, talk about Seneca, the Stoic, also talk about Xenophon a little bit. And then we'll move out of the classical period and talk about more modern thinkers, in part for his talk about, what's going on in Birth of Tragedy. And then there's a few thinkers that I was bringing up that you might not be all that familiar with, and it looks like I only brought down one of the books. One is Mikhail Bahktin. Some of you may be familiar with this book where he sort of lays out his theory of the festival. And then I wanted to talk about Johan Huizinga, the theorist of play, and Mircea Eliade, the great philosopher of religion, and what he had to say about all that sort of stuff. So for viewers at this point in time, so that's pretty cool. I better check to see whether people are signing in and saying, first time, welcome to everybody to the Hangout. So let me start by talking about Plato. And when we think about philosophy and festivals, at least for me, the first thing that comes to mind is his dialogue, the Symposium, which I've described as a weird drinking party where instead of drinking, which they do to some extent, they decide to put it off and start talking with each other about love. And it's a really interesting dialogue, in part because most of the people there are in fact related to each other in some sort of erotic fashion or another, and they each give this great speech, and it's a beautiful piece of literature. It's one of the finest in Western philosophy and literature. But there's not a lot of discussion of actual merrymaking. There's a lot of joking back and forth, some of which is easier to get in the Greek than in the English translations. And then finally, Alcibiades comes in at the end totally drunk and turns it into a real party, at which point he gives a speech and things start to break down. And it's a party that goes all the way until the morning, where there's just three people left arguing with each other, Socrates and the representatives of tragedy and comedy, debating about whether the same person could in fact be a comedian or a tragedian. And then, the guy who's narrating it wakes up. He's passed out before that, so it's quite a party. And then everything continues. And I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up I talked about this at the Culinary Institute of America at one of their conferences that was held outdoors a number of years ago, and we actually did do some drinking of some, I forget exactly what it was brewed, but they brought in some stuff. And my talk was called "Why Did We Quit Drinking?" and it was about symposia. And, you know, this is a very common way of engaging with each other in the ancient world. You'd have these drinking parties. They're primarily for the upper and middle classes. And we had a lot of representatives of that in literature. So one that I wanted to bring up, Xenophon, he actually has a symposium as well. And in their symposium, they do drink and they don't send away the entertainers, and Socrates actually gets into an argument with one of the people who's in charge of the entertainment. So it's quite an interesting piece. There's a lot of great discussion going on in that. And you might want to take a look at that. But one of the other things I wanted to bring up is we know from Diogenes Laertes and from Plutarch that many other people wrote symposia in the ancient world, including Epicurus. Now, wouldn't it be interesting to have Epicurus's symposium and be able to see what he's talking about in there? And then Plutarch himself wrote this thing that's usually translated as the Symposiacs. It's very long. What else can we say about it? It's got all these sub-discussions where he's bringing up other people and what they had to think about different things. And it goes on for quite a ways. So that might be worth checking out. But we know that there's probably many more literary symposia that we've lost over the course of time than we actually do possess. So that's something that's quite interesting. Let me take a question quick before I jump into anything else. This is from Pear, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. What topics does Socrates cover in Plato's Symposium? By the way, you sure look like Lebowski. Yeah, this is the dude sweater that my wife got me for Christmas. Last year, I said I was going to shoot some videos where I was, sort of taking on the persona of the dude. And the reason that she got it for me was precisely because in some of my older videos, maybe I'll do this right now. In some of my older videos where I have my hair down, because my hair is actually quite long, people would remark on them, looks like the dude is teaching philosophy. Now my hair is actually quite a bit longer than Jeff Bridges' character was in that, but I do get, like if I go bowling, especially, I've got some pictures of me going bowling, actually duck pin bowling, which is the little bowling things in this sweater. You can see them on my Facebook page, and I think on my Google Plus. People would say, well, the dude is here, but of course it's a dude with glasses who has a good bit of gray hair. His beard is turning white, so an aged dude. Okay, so back, what do they talk about in Plato's Symposium? It's a great question. It's about love. And so everybody is supposed to give a speech about love. And it's an amazing dialogue, in part because Plato is able to imitate all their genres. He's able to make a medical doctor talk like a physicist, a physical, or you say somebody who's obsessed with the physics of the time. He's able to make Aristophanes do a comedic thing. Agathon talks like a rhetor. It's really quite amazing. And each of them gives a speech that builds to a climax. And then there's a denouement when, like I said, Alcibiades, who's in love with Socrates, comes in and stirs things up. Bob Knight asks, was Socrates real? Yeah, Socrates is real. He was an actual historical person. It's interesting. There are these people who have theories, and this not only applies to Socrates and Jesus, but there's even discussion about, like, was there a historical Buddha? Was there a historical Confucius? It goes throughout the thing. There's always somebody who's a skeptic and who's like, well, the only evidence we have is this text where somebody talked about it. Yeah, that's the evidence. I mean, that's the way it is for pretty much everybody who lived in ancient times. And there's, historians don't, at least historians in the mainstream, don't think that there's any good reason to doubt that Socrates or Confucius or Jesus or the Buddha, or pick whoever you like, existed. And the people who do think no, we don't have evidence for it, they're really on the fringe. But sometimes they present themselves as if they're in the mainstream. Let me take a few other things. So yeah, the dude. Are you going to attend the annual Dudist convention next year? I don't know where it is, so I suppose I could if it's nearby. I know they had it in Milwaukee, or there's some sort of Milwaukee Lebowski Fest every year, and I suppose I should go to it. But it's probably in the summer, and this might be a little bit hot to wear, so I'd have to do something like, I guess, wear the bathrobe or something along those lines. I haven't watched the movie for quite some time, so I'll have to do some research about that. All right, so let me come back to what I wanted to talk about. So symposia are these drinking parties, and we changed the meaning of the term somewhere along the line so that they became these very staid academic affairs where nobody's doing any drinking and everybody shuts up so the people up on the stage can chitter chatter about whatever it happens to be, world peace, or this kind of food product, or I don't know, there's probably a whole bunch of symposia on very trivial things. Aristotle makes fun of people for writing panegyrics about salt. I'm sure there's somebody who's had a symposium on deodorant or something along those lines. So what symposia were originally were, these parties where people would get together, and they weren't always necessarily friends with each other. Some of them might actually be rivals. But they would drink and they would have a good time, and there was some entertainment. And if they wanted to chat about something important, they could. If they just wanted to, eat good food and enjoy themselves. So what is it like? It's like a dinner party. But think about a dinner party. A lot of dinner parties are kind of stuffy affairs. There's all this protocol involved in it. Think about a fun dinner party with your friends, with plenty of good liquor and beer. I'm into beer myself. And, you get to talk about stuff at your leisure. That's what a symposium was like. And I think that's something important for doing not just philosophy, but really anything that involves creativity and also interpretation. These personal interactions turn out to be so important. I've had so many great ideas. Well, I won't call them great. I've had so many ideas that I've gotten in conversations with people, very often not at the actual, official symposium, but in the reception afterwards, chatting over some beers and or going out for a meal or something like that. And I think that this is an important component to philosophy. Not everybody's philosophy, granted, but to quite a few people. So that leads into one of the other topics. Okay, I'm going to let's see here. Let me answer a few other things. Off-topic thoughts on loss of festivity due to the loss of religious sentiment, and Joseph Pieper's work related to it. I haven't read Pieper's work related to it, but it might be connected to what we'll talk about a little bit later on in here. Yeji writes, I wish I could hold a symposium. Sounds fun. Yeah, it was one of those things that in ancient times, you generally had to have some resources to be able to do, but we can do it on a smaller scale, just getting together with a few friends and, having something. It doesn't necessarily have to be intoxicants. We could always do it over tea or coffee. But there has to be, I think, an element of play or enjoyment or fun involved in it. So let me talk about one of the other people I wanted to bring up, the Stoics. When we think of the Stoics, we don't think of people necessarily having a good time. Now, if you went to Stoicon, then you probably, and you went to the reception, you probably saw some people actually enjoying themselves. And interestingly, all of the people on the modern Stoicism team are people who I would say unqualifiedly know how to have a good time with other people. So, are they diverging from it? Seneca has this great letter where he's talking about festivals. And he talks about the Saturnalia. this is particularly, apt because we're going here, like in the United States, into the holiday season, as we call it, right? And the reason why we say the holiday season is so everybody can be included, because we've got, Hanukkah, we've got Christmas. Sometimes we get other things, that are cyclical winding up at the same time. We have Kwanzaa. Then we have the New Year's, which is always kind of a bit of a bacchanalia. And, the Saturnalia was the day that eventually became Christmas. And it was a time for excess. It was a time for craziness. It was a time to let loose, And so Seneca says it's December and everybody's sweating. Why are they sweating? Because, the time for this festival is here. And then he considers something. He says, I think a lot of people think that you should avoid this as a Stoic, right? You should try to get away from any sort of merrymaking, because that's going to be tempting and you will lose your self-control and you will not be, dignified and all that. And he says, well, you could go that way. But on the other hand, if you can go to the party and not get, so drunk that you're falling down and throwing up over yourself and making passes at people and hooking up with random strangers, then that actually probably shows more self-control than just saying, oh, I'm not going to do this at all. So, you could say Seneca is saying, don't be a party pooper, just partake in parties moderately. Don't allow yourself to be just drawn in and do all the crazy stuff. Epictetus says something kind of similar. As a matter of fact, I wrote a piece for Stoicism today last year about that sort of thing, and I might revisit it again this coming year. Epictetus says, when there's a festival and you see the children clapping their hands and doing all the stuff, don't get down on them. Don't say, oh, that's for juvenile people. Let them do what they're going to do. And as a matter of fact, if they come up to you and they want you to clap your hands to them, go ahead and do that, because it's really a small gesture. You don't have to get so involved in it. And I think that's really great advice if you're trying to practice some sort of intentional, philosophically based lifestyle. Now, of course, if you're an alcoholic, maybe don't have a drink, right? If you know that you have problems with things, maybe you do need to avoid that sort of thing for the time being, right? But in general, if you're trying to improve your life, that doesn't mean that you have to strip away every single possible pleasure, especially at a time where that's probably going to be a downer for other people. I mean, unless you've got the kind of friends who are constantly yelling, "Let's do shots," and they can't have a good time unless you're doing shots with them. You're probably not going to hurt anybody by just drinking a moderate amount and smiling and enjoying it, and then leaving the party when you want to leave it. And I think that's some pretty good advice. Let me come back to the comments. All right, so we got Roberto writes, we used to do it from time to time at a coffee shop during the university. Yeah, when I was a graduate student, one of the things that we used to do pretty regularly with some of the professors, the younger professors, was some of them would say, let's go to this coffee shop, which was not a very long walk from our campus, and just have some coffees and sit around and chat. And then some of the others like to go to bars, and we'd have some beers and continue the conversation afterwards. I thought that was great. I loved doing that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, last year, one of the things that they did for Stoicon last year that I thought was pretty cool in the idea, didn't quite work out the way they wanted, was to have some of the speakers, and I did this, make themselves available to go out and have dinner afterwards with some of the participants who signed up for it. It was like a fundraising thing that we were doing. It didn't work out that well, in part because it ended up being so noisy that it was hard to have a good conversation. But I think that, that sort of thing would really make a lot of sense to do in other ways. All right, so Ty writes, I have a friend who took Stoicism to mean it is his duty to tell the truth in such a degree that he tells people rather hurtful things, and then he says it is that person's fault if they get hurt. So that person's doing Stoicism wrong. That's all there is to say about that. I mean, if Epictetus were around and he ran into Epictetus would sort of lay into him and explain to him exactly how off base he was. But there's quite a few people like that. Yeah, I mean, the cure for that, I think, is learning more Stoicism, which means, actually seeing what the Stoics wrote about these sorts of matters. Um, Pear writes, one wonders what Hegel would have to say about festivals and collective consciousness, if anything at all. And then also writes, do animals celebrate any festival? Well, I don't know about animals celebrating festivals, but animals sure do like to play with each other, and I think that's a key component. Like when we take our dogs, we've got two dogs laying around here. You heard one of them drinking water earlier, probably. Um, they're old, so they don't go to the dog park very, very frequently anymore because they're arthritic and they try to do too much. They try to run with the other dogs, and it's not good for them. But when they were younger and we take them to the dog park, that's like a holiday for them, right? They get to smell everybody and run around and do things, and so I don't know if that's a festival or not, but could be. And I don't know. Do birds have festivals like when they're getting together? Elephants. Um, Elephants actually seem to take stock of each other's deaths, which I guess would throw Heidegger for a bit of a loop. And I think other animals do as well. Not all of our festivals are necessarily celebratory festivals. If you think about funerals and like grave cleaning festivals, like Qingming and traditional Chinese stuff, I think those are quite important as well. Now, does Hegel have anything to say about festivals? I mean, he actually uses the festival in the preface to the phenomenology, where like everybody's this bacchanalian thing. So of course he was aware of that, and Hegel seemed to be a guy who had a good time from time to time. By the way, so was Kant. Kant was really into dinner parties, and I haven't looked at Hegel's aesthetics, but I'm willing to bet that there's something in there. Now, Darren writes about something that I don't really know about. Could you quickly give your opinion on found herentism? That's not even a word that I know, so I don't have any opinion on it. I'm not sure what it is. So if you want to write something about that, maybe what the idea is, I'll take a look at that. Pierre, following up on that, my theory is they play to digest extra food energy. I don't think that there is a single functional explanation for play, and I don't think we need one. I think that it's an element of life once it gets to a certain level that it engages in something like play for enjoyment. I mean, there's also functional things like when cats are wrestling with each other, they're learning how to fight and how to take down animals. All of that sort of stuff, but I don't know that we need it. Ty writes, I normally miss these opportunities to say how much I appreciate the knowledge you share, so thank you so much. I'll be returning to your videos for years to come. That's very nice for you to say. I'm glad, and I'm going to keep on producing the videos. I can't imagine a time when I'm going to stop, not just because I actually enjoy doing it, but because it seems to me that there's so much that still hasn't been done in YouTube for centered in the text discussions of things. I mean, you can find lots of 5-minute sort of glitzy videos on this or that thing, but they often don't have a lot of content, unfortunately, and sometimes they're actually wrong, and those do tend to get a lot of views. But I think, and I try to get my colleagues into shooting videos. It's an incredibly difficult sell to try to get anybody to post anything online if they're academics, unfortunately. Daniel has a very nice comment too. I love your channel. Keep up the good work. I certainly will. So there's a little bit of a lull. Let me come back then to some of the stuff that I had wanted to discuss. I mentioned the Stoics, and I also said I was going to talk a little bit about Nietzsche. If you think about the birth of tragedy, right? It's about these festivals and what's taking place in Greece, and we usually, in terms of the Dionysiac versus Apollonian, associate festivals with the Dionysiac, this letting loose, this losing ourselves in the crowd, in an intoxication. And there is something to that, but I think the Apollonian is also very important to keep in mind. For Nietzsche, you really get the most mileage out of both Dionysiac and Apollonian when they're working together. And then the bad guy is actually the Socratic, the one who's rationalist, the one who thinks everything can be explained. And you might say, in some respects, the Plato's Symposium is a less Socratic dialogue than, say, the Phaedo, or in Nietzsche's sense, right? There's more respect given to the power of eros, of desire and drive. It's true, it's being sublimated to this higher thing and ultimately leading to the form of beauty or the form of the good. But there's this understanding that we have to have this engagement in our real life and with other people. So Nietzsche, I think is an important person to bring up in this light. The Birth of Tragedy is kind of interesting, but also, if you think about what's going on in the genealogy of morals and talking about punishment and how cruelty, Nietzsche has this theory that societies that are able to countenance a certain amount of what appears to be just sort of wanton cruelty are also, in a certain respect, freer societies, closer to what you might say the original of human existence is, and that there's some joy involved in it. Obviously not joy for the person who's suffering, but there's more what he calls cheerfulness involved. And he thinks that this is something that got lost in the shuffle, particularly through Christianity, and you might say the sublimation of various religious activities into that. All right, let's see what we got here coming up. Nate writes, I am reviewing for a final about Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. Could you perhaps briefly summarize the core tenet of each philosophy? So that's not really about festivals and holidays or anything like that. And I will give it a very quick shot. And then if you want to do a follow-up with me, that's the sort of thing you'd book a tutorial session for, rather than trying to, out with final exam prep on this. So Stoicism, live in accordance with nature, and that means a fully developed human nature. Epicureanism, pleasure and pain are the only good and evil. Everything's evaluated in terms of that. Skepticism, well, we don't really know about anything, and to every argument in equal argument can be opposed. So that's not going to get you through a final exam, though. That's not quite enough. Aaron writes, Dr. Sadler, really love your channel. Greetings from Honduras. Well, thanks. I'm glad that you do. Kyle, some have commented that one of the largest gatherings of modern Stoics could be on Wizard Chan, a site for male celibates. Are you aware of this community? No, I'm barely aware of any of the Chans. My briefest brush with that was digging a little bit around 4chan because I'd been turned into a meme on there. I don't know anything about Wizard Chan. And I think that, you can be a Stoic whether you're celibate or married or, whatever. There's all sorts of possibilities for that. So I don't think it's necessarily associated with celibacy. Maybe the idea of having an intentional lifestyle, but unless I actually went on and checked it out, I would not automatically assume that the Stoicism in particular, particularly given that many people take one bit of Stoicism and then say, I'm a Stoic, rather than looking at the other stuff which tends to go against what they're doing. So, I don't know. I can't really say anything about it. Andrew Hooper, are we ever going to hear your banjo Sabbath covers? So I don't actually have any Black Sabbath covers that I do on my banjo, but I do have some other things in metal. I do a lot. I do a good bit of Scorpions and some Judas Priest, some Motorhead. Some Tank. Some UFO. I don't think I have any Sabbath stuff that I've done. I mean, I've played around with it before, but usually it requires me to find the guitar chords for it, right? So are we ever going to hear my banjo stuff? Yeah, I got to practice before I would do that, but maybe I'll get it out at the end of this. We'll see. What's my opinion on Richard Rorty? Well, you've got Rickard Rorty. That would be a better name than Richard Rorty. Rickard's kind of a cool name. I think he was big stuff when I was in graduate school. I never found him very interesting because he was basically saying, look, Heidegger and Dewey and Wittgenstein are all more or less doing the same thing. And I mean, we were doing that as graduate students, so I just wasn't particularly impressed. And he was being positioned as sort of the end of the, pragmatist lineage. And I was like, well, that's an example of why I don't have to think too much about them. Para writes, oh, here we go. There's a little bit, I skipped down a little bit. Daniel writes, been reading Either Or by Søren Kierkegaard and was wondering what your take on him is in regards to Hegel's philosophy, since as far as I'm aware, he disagreed with a lot of Hegel's views. Yeah, he disagreed with quite a few of Hegel's views. He knew his Hegel. The disagreement is often less pronounced than a lot of summaries make it out to be. He's more actually attacking the Hegelians of his time than Hegel himself, but using Hegel as kind of a foil. So, for example, he'll criticize Hegel for saying that faith is what you start with, and then you move into, a fuller understanding of the religious object. But in many respects, I think it's worth, if we think about Kierkegaard's like three, stages, right? You've got the aesthetic stage, then the ethical stage, then the religious stage. And the people who really represent the theorizing of the ethical stage the most are Socrates and Hegel. And the ethical isn't something bad. It's just there's more than what can be fit within it. And so it's not like Hegel is somehow bad or awful. He's sure as hell is better than a lot of other philosophers as far as Kierkegaard is concerned. I almost said Heidegger, but Heidegger actually thought very highly of Hegel too. But he's missing something. There's something that went wrong in the process. And so, it's always worth remembering that Kierkegaard himself is a dialectical thinker. And he's not aiming at some sort of higher synthesis that encompasses everything. But the ethical isn't something bad. It's actually, very important in our lives. Block somebody who wrote something. All right. Think twice. How would you connect your last assumption about Nietzsche with his idea of ressentiment? Well, I'm not making any assumptions about Nietzsche. Those are there in the text. And the notion of ressentiment. Yeah, ressentiment, for those who don't know, you can find a really great discussion of this in the genealogy, but it winds up being discussed in other places. Ressentiment comes about because people are unable to express their affects of desire for revenge, and they have to shove it down or tell themselves stories about why they shouldn't do that. And that tends to lead to, not just for that person, but also for a culture, a situation in which they're not going to be able to be spontaneous. They're going to be trying to pull everything down. These are going to be people who are not good partiers. They're not going to be fun to have around, and they're going to be detracting from things. So a culture that's filled with ressentiment is going to be a culture that doesn't really know how to have a lot of fun. That's what I would say. Para writes, Nietzsche says knowledge kills action and action requires the veils of illusion. Is knowledge then the veil of illusion, or an action which is not an illusion must be free from knowledge? Is this abyss? He's only saying that about one thing. He's not saying that this applies to every single circumstance. So that's coming from the genealogy. And, there's different kinds of knowledge. So not all knowledge automatically results in us not being able to do anything. And really, if you think about what's going, this is part of what I talked about in my seminars and my webinar last month talking about Nietzsche. He talks about the problem of life in the Birth of Tragedy. Later on, he'll talk about an abyss, right? But the problem of life is realizing that life doesn't have any meaning to it, and it may, in fact, induce in us a sense of nausea. He uses the term there in that work. That's like staring into the abyss in the later stuff. Tu Il Shmuel writes, for me, the greatest thing about Stoicism was helping me understand what is in my control and what is out of my control, and thus helped me deal with my anger. Yeah, that's actually what led me into paying more attention to Stoicism myself. If you know my biography, which I've talked about in different places here and there, so if you don't know it, but I think a lot of you have heard me in other places. I got into studying Stoicism seriously because I was doing a lot of work on anger and looking at philosophical resources, in Aristotle and Plato, also in Plutarch, who's a Platonic thinker and Christian thought, and then in the Stoics. And I found a lot of really cool stuff there. And that's probably what helped me take the Stoics more seriously, because I'd studied them before, but I hadn't really taken them that seriously. And if to go back to the theme of like festivals and holidays, right, can be really helpful in that distinction between what's in my control and what's not in my control. You can plan a party and nobody can show up. Sometimes I do these online events and it's like I pick the wrong time and 5 or 6 people show up, sometimes 100 people show up, sometimes more. You can set things up in such a way that it looks like, things should come together well, but you don't have any control over that. There's so many outside factors. Like sometimes we would do these events here in town at libraries, and we do them like on a Thursday night. Attended, and then it would happen to fall on the one night that it's a Thursday night Packer game. Well, we can bet hardly anybody's going to show up, right? And that's what happens. You can make a dinner party and have all these people that you think are cool people get together, and you just didn't realize that these other two know each other and have a personality conflict going back to their high school days or something like that. That's not on you. That's just the way things pan out sometimes. So I think that's Aaron writes, maybe a systematic approach of Kierkegaard's ideas through his criticism towards Hegel. I'm sure that's done, somewhere in the secondary literature. I'm not a big secondary literature person, in part because I work on so many different figures that I would never have the time to read much of the secondary lit and get to spend time with the primary texts. I don't really even get enough time with them. Retro Gamer brings up the sweater again. Was it Jeff Bridges' character, The Dude, which furnished your selection of the sweater you wear? You are the dude. My wife bought me the sweater for Christmas last year. And she bought it for me because I had so many comments on my YouTube things when I had my hair down, like when I was teaching at Marist, that, oh, this is the dude teaching philosophy. When I put my hair up, unfortunately, and because I'm, kind of a fat guy, I would instead get, especially if I wore a suit, oh, is Penn from Penn and Teller teaching philosophy? So let's see what we got here. Jumping around a little bit in the thing. See, Chris, how does Heidegger's view of existentialism differ from Sartre's? Well, I'll just give a really short answer to that. Heidegger got rid of the term existentialist when he found out what Sartre thought it was, and he wasn't the only one. Gabriel Marcel did the same thing. They were willing to leave it to him. Heidegger thinks that Sartre is wrong in thinking that existentialism or an existentialist analysis should be a humanist perspective. And so the source you want to look at for that is the Letter on Humanism. All right, so Darren has a follow-up. Foundherentism is the codification of coherentism and foundationalism in epistemology. Do you think the idea of joining the two concepts together is possible to do? I don't know. Whenever people are using isms and stuff like that in you know, philosophy, it's usually coming out of some discussions in analytic philosophy. They usually tend to be extremely abstract and require some, you know, reading of a literature that I haven't read. I don't know what's meant. I know what foundationalism typically means, although it means a bunch of different things, depending on what discourse you're in. I'm not sure what coherentism means, and so whether they could be combined, I'm really not the guy to tell you. Subconscious writes, can you please name some of the philosophical works in modern analytic philosophy that you've found intellectually stimulating? So I don't read a lot of modern analytic stuff, meaning stuff from like the 70s on, in part because I just simply don't have the time. You know, the David Lewis and his world, you know, many worlds semantics was kind of big when I was in graduate school, and I dug around a bit in that and thought it was, you know, kind of interesting, but I thought that authors are doing far more interesting stuff with that than the philosophers were. I like, you know, I like some of the older analytic stuff. I love reading John Wisdom, but he's kind of a interesting fellow. He doesn't fit the mold of a typical analytic philosopher. He's willing to read across into, you know, Freud and Sartre and try to make sense of that sort of stuff. You know, I guess you could say that you know, I mean, at a certain point he quit being an analytic philosopher, but I love Alasdair MacIntyre's stuff. And I find his early stuff very interesting. Rose, of course. Who else? You know, I like reading around in the older stuff when they were just kind of figuring out that the logicist project was not going to work. Wittgenstein is somebody who I go back to and I enjoy reading. You know, I talked about my Wittgenstein phase when I was really quite enamored of him. I don't, you know, nobody really comes to mind in contemporary analytic stuff where I'm like, wow, this is really amazing. I need to read this stuff and respond to it. So, you know, in part because, you know, I was just saying, so foundationalism can mean a number of different things. One of the problems with the current analytic philosophy, and this is what I'm getting from friends who are analytic philosophers, is that you have all these discourses and they love to coin new terminology, and it means one thing in epistemology and another thing in philosophy of language. And so you got to do so much digging. It's basically like a new form of scholasticism. You know, as Hobbes said, jangling with words rather than attending to the things themselves. And I find that very unproductive. It's just, you know, I've only got so many hours per day, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Rednga writes, what do you think about postmodern theology? And it's interesting you mentioned Alistair in that, because he is like really, unless I'm mistaken, he's really old hat. I read Alistair, the Death of God theology stuff. Interesting, but you know, not that interesting. Being made about what's modern, sort of like reading Bultmann, you know. You read stuff like, well, because we can flip the light switch on and off, everything's changed. And you're like, all of these, like, you know, the old stuff is all dead, you know, pronouncements, they're all forgotten and the old stuff still sticks around. Caputo, I never took Caputo very seriously. Maybe I should have, I don't know. I've seen him talk at conferences. I've read some of his stuff, just never really got into it. You know, and I think that the word postmodern is one of those terms that meanings of it are all over the map. You know, all you got to do is like read Jameson's work on it, where he's identifying 4 different, very clear senses of it. And so I never use that word very much. Oh, here's a good one from Daniel. Is it morally justified to tell children Santa Claus exists in order to influence them into behaving more appropriately? If that's the only justification for telling them that Santa Claus exists, I'd say no. There's other ways of getting people to behave more appropriately. But then again, I told my kids Santa Claus does exist. Exists in several different ways. I mean, he's right? So if you actually do believe that people continue on after their death, which I do, there's a whole different can of worms to get into. And you think that there is a Saint Nicholas. He does exist. He's not the guy wearing the red suit, right? So there's a different thing right there. But then you can tell an interesting story about how the people who are wearing the red suits are in some way participating in the narrative about Saint Nicholas. And obviously you don't try to lay this on a 3-year-old or 5-year-old or something like that. But it's not as if it's just pure fabrication if we're coming at it from a certain aspect. And if you think about what are we supposed to be doing, emulating that guy who was a pretty good guy in many respects. By the way, I'll mention that one of the people who I work on, St. Anselm, he's got a prayer to St. Nicholas. And why? Why would he have a prayer to St. Nicholas? Because St. Nicholas was not known for presents or anything like that back in the Middle Ages. He was viewed as a very important model and intercessor. It's kind of interesting to take a look at. But yeah, if it's just trying to police their behavior, I don't think it's a good thing. Great lecture on Heidegger's analysis of the cave in juxtaposition with your appraisal of both. I'm glad you liked it. I'll be shooting 3 more videos, 3 more core concept videos on that piece. The guy who commissioned it actually got quite a bargain because I originally thought I could do the thing in just 1 video and then realized I needed to do 4. Follow-up, do you think there's a relation between Plato's forms and the furnishing of individual instincts in an anti-intelligible transition? A relationship between Plato's forms and individual instincts. I don't know what that would possibly be, so say what that would wind up being. We're getting a lot of, I had to take a minute to block another porn bot. It's kind of funny. I guess they saw a holiday festival and they thought, we're looking for a different kind of festival. So, all right, Sage Master. Some say about life that you're inside of it, so everything you can find can only be a piece of it, since it is the lens through which you view the world, so it is bigger than meaning just got here. Well, okay, that makes sense. I mean, here's a sort of application of that comes up. Like, people are always like, what texts do I have to read? I don't want to waste my time on the wrong texts in philosophy, and I don't want to get the wrong ideas. I gotta and you're like, whoa, slow down. To begin with, nobody can read all the texts that are available, and you probably can't even work your way through all the essential texts in the history of philosophy, because I can't, right? And I do this full time, and I've been doing it for years now. It's not so important that you try to have the right perspective, and then everything will fall into place. We are in process. We are, as the the French would say, we're already on the voyage. I'm thinking about Maurice Blondel, who I wrote my dissertation on and don't read very often anymore. He said, we're already embarked. Doesn't mean that we can't get some sort of sense of it. It doesn't mean that some people don't have better conceptions of life than others. But yeah, do we ever have like a total, got everything totally figured out kind of view? I don't think so. Retro Gamer writes, boy, a lot of stuff here. I got to scroll up a bit. Forms becoming shadow representation and instinctual, perhaps unearthed by emotion. Now I think I understand what you're talking about. So really what you're asking about is, how does what we call the Platonic doctrine of recollection work, right? Is there something that's not purely intellectual about it, but affective? And I think the answer for Plato is yes. There actually is. I don't know that I would say in terms of instinct, hardwiring, but certainly there is an affective response. I mean, he talks about this very clearly in dialogue after dialogue after dialogue. Peppo writes, Dr. Sadler, what's your take on the view that Stoicism is a watered-down version of cynicism? I believe the following statement is attributed to Epictetus: if you can't be a cynic, at least be a Stoic. I don't recall seeing that, and I've read Epictetus many times. Epictetus has a great chapter profession where he says, this is not for 99% of you, or for me, by the way. But here's what to expect if you're going to be a cynic. And interestingly, we learn more about the cynics chapter than we do from any existing cynic literature. So we don't really have much to go on. It would be, just from a scholarly perspective, to say Stoicism is a watered-down version of cynicism, that would be a very speculative stance to take, because we don't actually have the documents to support that. I don't see it as that. I see those as two different paths, and I think that the Stoics were right that the Cynics may have gone too far with some things. I also think that comic portrayals of the Cynics and the Stoics, clearly there were plenty of people talking the talk about being cynics, but really just being jerks. Doing that with Stoicism as well, but yeah. All right, Elijah asks, is it possible to syncretize a total belief in God with a total acceptance of science? Depends on what you believe, what you mean by belief in God and science there. So, those mean multiple things again. All right, I'm going to skip down a little bit. Alexei writes, what does Stoicism say on idealism, or does that differ between philosophers? I'd have to know what idealism means there. Idealism is one of those terms that means a lot of different things as well. Here's a good one. Stanislav writes, I'm a student, first year of philosophy. Do you have any advice for studying things I need to keep an eye out for, take my time with it, anything at all concerning my academia? Yeah, I mean, remember that every philosophical text, if it's a classic, the more times you read it, the more you're going to find in it. And it's okay to forget things, because you can always go back to the text unless you lose the book. And we're fortunate now that we live in an age where books are easy to get, and oftentimes they're available in PDF form online, right? or in other forms. So you don't have to really sweat that so much. I'd say that as a beginning student, and there's a lot of, it really depends on a person's temperament and how they're approaching philosophy, but I would say that it's better to try to find a few thinkers who you get a lot out of, and you'll learn that by experience, and spend time with them. Keep going back to their works. See if you can find other people that are interested in them as well. If you're lucky enough to be able to find a class, that's great. A lot of the thinkers that we'd like to study, we often have difficulty finding classes on them, and then sometimes the class might be taught by somebody who doesn't really like the thinker, because of the way academics work. But definitely, here's one other thing. It's a bit of negative advice. Whatever the people in philosophy tell you is the stuff that you have to learn, because that's the most important, and everybody's studying this, and everything before it was crap, and everybody has to go through this, whether it be something in analytic philosophy or continental philosophy, or if you're in certain Catholic institutions that you must read St. Thomas because he has the right words on everything. Full of crap. And, you can look at this historically and see people making those sorts of assertions over and over and over and over again. And it never turns out to be that way, We've been told a million times now, metaphysics is dead, or this is done. And the stuff that's really cool, back. You're never going to keep Plato down. You can punch him down as many times as you like. He's going to keep on coming back. Same thing with Aristotle. Same thing with the Stoics. And we may reinterpret it in different ways, but and we want to think about who's worth studying now? some of the people that wrote stuff in the 20th century, we're going to keep reading them long after I'm dead, and if those of you who are younger than me, after you're dead. But most of them are not. Most of them are going to be the equivalent of Herbert Spencer, where he's there's books you can read them. Nobody cracks them open anymore. So. All right, Adham, my question is, what would the Stoics say about bullying? How would they deal with it? What would Epictetus or Seneca or Cicero approach such a topic? So I've written about this in my blog, Orexis Dia Noetique. I've actually addressed this issue a couple of different times. Obviously, don't bully. Right? So that's probably not what you're asking about. But one of the key issues is, should you just say, oh, I'm a Stoic, so I'm not going to let it get to me? Well, unless you're the sage, it probably is going to get to you. So you may need to do something about it. And bullying is unjust, and the Stoics say that we're supposed to try to attain justice. So there may be cases where you would actually intervene. And if you're seeing somebody who's vulnerable, who's not a Stoic, getting bullied, and you have the resources to actually intervene, you would want to do that. So, all right. Okay, here's a good one from Kyle. Is spectator sports a festivity, and is it something the ancient Stoics looked down upon? Yeah, I think for the most part they tended to look down upon spectator sports, which I mean, some of them, like the gladiatorial combats, right, or chariot racing, right. Now Epictetus has a lot of metaphors drawn from athletic training and the Olympics, so clearly they didn't think that all spectator sports were bad. I mean, the notion that like sports should become what we're fascinated with, that would be a problem for the Stoics, and not just the Stoics. I mean, think about Augustine and his talking about in the Confessions, the fascination that people had with gladiatorial combats or with other things going on. There's a tendency for people who get really involved in sports to make that their world. By the way, if you ever want to see a movie that illustrates the sadness and despair underlying that sort of attitude, watch the movie Buffalo. I think it's Buffalo 66 with Vincent Gallo. Watch the depiction of his mom, who's obsessed with the Buffalo Bills and their comeback chances and all of that. Myself, I'm a Packers fan. I'm actually also a Bears fan, believe it or not, too, which for a lot of people is anathema. But I have family in Chicago, so I kind of grew up liking both. Both of whom are doing terrible this year, by the way. That with adopting a sort of philosophical attitude. I enjoy the games, and I don't let myself get too anxious about what the score is. And if somebody does a good play on the other side, I enjoy that. But I see a lot of people who get very, very, very wrapped up in that, and it becomes almost like a surrogate family, religion, friendship. So that can be kind of an issue for people. Okay, Retro Gamer, McIntyre's a virtue ethicist or some other area in early work. He becomes a virtue ethicist in before or after virtue. He's already moving in that direction, but he starts out actually in analytic philosophy and as a Marxist. And then he goes through a lot of transformations. And I can say too, knowing him personally, although not having corresponded with him for quite some time, this is who walks the walk. He's the real deal. Sean writes, is the Prolegomena a good introduction to Kant? Well, Kant thought it was. But it's a tough work, I don't know that there is any good introduction to Kant, unfortunately. So the ideas that Kant is working with, they are to some degree difficult ideas, but the terminology is so much of what gets in the way of the average student. There are places where once you actually know what he's saying and you hear what he's saying, you're like, he can't possibly mean that, can he? And the answer is usually yes, because Kant is uncompromising on certain things. Like, listen, happiness has nothing to do with morality. Does he really mean that? Yep, he really means that. So, is the Prolegomena a good introduction? Yeah, I mean, it is. It's certainly a lot easier than reading the first critique, which is really a head cracker. But it takes some work. All right. Shane asks, he's wondering if I've run into Larry Arnhart's work and what's my general opinion. I don't know Arnhart, unfortunately, so I can't say anything. Bella Hazard writes, have you read Logicomics? It's a graphic novel about Bertrand Russell. Actually, a friend of mine sent a copy to me as a birthday present years back, and I have read it, and it is about Russell. But if it was only about Russell, I probably wouldn't want to read it because I'm not a fan of Russell. But it also discusses Wittgenstein and Gödel and all these other things that are going on at the time, which is pretty cool. Frank has philosophy exam in 15 minutes. Good luck. Bella Hazard, I would have loved to hear about Santa in that way when I was little. Yeah, me too. I mean, I grew up in a family with sort of kind of contradictory stuff about Santa, which was cool because at least then you can kind of slip through the cracks. Because on the one hand, Santa Claus was coming on the night of the 24th, right? But because we were French, because my family's French Canadian, we also had the Fête de Saint Nicolas, right? So you put your boots out, and then they get filled up with if you're bad, coal, which meant actually charcoal briquettes from the grill. And that was sort of like a warning, you better get your act in gear because there's only a couple weeks. But then, if you were good, you'd get like candy and oranges and stuff. And so we thought it was a little bit strange. My jacket looks so comfortable. It is indeed a comfortable sweater. So it's quite nice. And I'm glad that I got it for Christmas. Have you ever heard Professor Paula Gottlieb of UW-Madison? She's a specialist in Aristotle. No, never met her. I don't know that she's actually been here for the Aristotle conference that they have at Marquette. I should probably contact her. I mean, if you know her, go ahead and put a bug in her ear. Para writes, can you kindly give a brief introduction on philosophy of language and its functional significance and impact? No, not really. I mean, philosophy of language, that's a big field. That's actually something I was very interested in when I first started school. Its functional significance and impact, I'm not sure what its functional significance means. Its impact, very important in the 20th century. Analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, both deeply imbued with studies of language. Retro Gamer, do you think that when reading a text, you should set out thinking you have a question to mind that you're trying or hoping to have an answer, or answers which lead to other questions? It certainly can't hurt, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. Ways of approaching a text, so that's good. Marcos, thoughts on Aristotle's magnanimous man, the great-souled man? Is this the person closest to perfect morality? Certainly from an Aristotelian perspective, he is. Interestingly, magnanimity for the Stoics, gets brought under the virtue of courage. So you'll see that discussed in like Cicero. Actually, I think John Sellers recently it was either John Sellers or Chris Gill recently did a talk about Stoicism and magnanimity. That's something that later on becomes seen to be an example of like Augustine talking about how the ancients regarded great vices as virtues. So principled uncertainty. I told you philosophy was going viral. Yeah, well, that's cool when it happens. Oh, Tony, any thoughts on critical theory of the projects of the Frankfurt School? Yeah, I actually I never did much publishing, although I did publish a piece. One of the very first pieces I published was on Adorno, and it actually got used quite a bit in an online journal called Minerva. Very good, but other people seem to have liked it. I like reading Adorno. I find it extremely difficult to summarize or to write about him because his work is like all over the map. The other guys, I do like some of the stuff that they have to say. A lot of it's kind of, where I'll read it and I'm like, I see where they're coming from. I don't really buy this, but there's some interesting insights there. So yeah. Let me skip down a bit. Is metaphysical knowledge necessary for mental stability? Doesn't anxiety increase if there's a great number of different possibilities for the way reality is structured, but then you need education? I guess it could help. I mean, I don't think everybody needs to study philosophy in order to like make their way through their life and not suffer from anxiety. There's other ways of doing that. I think for some people, once you embark on it, the only way out is like going through it, sort of like Descartes' meditations, Sev writes, I would like to know if Carl Jung has any impact on your views. I know he's inspired by Nietzsche to attempt to revivify our connection with God. No, I enjoy reading Jung, but I can't say he has any real impact on my views. So, but I haven't read him for a while, so you never know down the line, perhaps. Let's see here. Retro Gamer writes, would Dr. Sadler have the concept of a classical education comprising of grammar, logic, and rhetoric? You mean like, would I be endorsing that? I certainly don't think it could hurt. I don't think that it should be like the only thing that we teach, the way that some classical schools, usually run by conservatives, like to do. When it comes to a lot of things, I'm becoming more and more of a pluralist these days, where I recognize that different approaches are needed for what we want to do is be able to provide, especially for students, we want to be able to provide them with what it is that they need at the time, which requires way better teachers. I think the way in which we teach education is a real mess. Resources, but we also need some real accountability. This is really a tough battle, especially here in the United States. Although things are kind of rough in a lot of other places too. Kyle asks, is piracy of digital content theft, and is it immoral? I don't know. It depends on what we mean by piracy. This is kind of a good question. Like, I think, bootleg DVDs and stuff like that, yeah, that's theft. Somebody is like, taking my videos, which has happened before, and then downloading them, basically ripping them because I don't have them set to download, then putting them on their channel and getting the meager money that YouTube wants to give for that sort of stuff. I guess that's piracy too. I don't have a very dim. I have a very dim view of academic publishing, and especially journal publishing, and the money that they rake in, getting authors to basically give them material for free, which then they charge huge rates for. And I don't have any problem with databases that let people get that, because it's sort of like imagine Robinhood, except it's like the ultra rich that he's stealing from. So I guess it kind of depends for me on different things. Robert Dupre writes, Dr. Sadler, keeping in the theme of holidays and festivity, which philosophers would you consider as playful or festive, at least in the way they write? Would you consider Plato to be one? Yeah, I would. Nietzsche certainly is too. I mean, Nietzsche is really fun to read, not only in the English, but in the original German. Other people are a chore no matter what you read them in, like Hegel, for example. Kant every once in a while will have a funny little quip here and there, but he's kind of a chore to read. And quite frankly, Aristotle is not fun to read. Epictetus is actually sometimes without necessarily meaning to be so. The way he talks to people, because he's got this sort of what we translate as freedom of speech or frankness parrhesia, but yeah, there's plenty of other philosophers who are quite good at that. And sometimes, like when you go to conferences and you meet some of these people, they surprise you at like how funny they can be. So that's kind of cool. Question here: if somebody is going to be retiring in a few years and they're worried about providing for his family in the future with his meager income, how can Stoicism help him stop worrying? There is actually a treatise in the Discourses in Book 4, if I remember right, where he doesn't address retirement, he just addresses poverty. And why is it that we fear poverty so much? That might be helpful to take a look at. As the more refined you become, isn't the case that one becomes more sensitive to violence of all sorts? So how can the intellectual, the philosopher, become stoic with working through much anger at injustice? Well, I mean, the anger doesn't help you to be getting angry at injustice. It's possible, like Seneca says, to have the same reaction from reason, and to use practical reason to resist injustice rather than to rely on anger. And actually, Seneca treats this on anger. He says, argument that anger is becoming of the wise person, then the wise person is going to be pissed off all the time. And that can't possibly be the case, precisely because of what you're noting, which is that they're aware of how things are wrong. Okay, this is Assad. I'm going to grad school next year in University of Toronto. Any advice? Well, that's a great school to go to. Make as many connections as you can. Bridges with people because of stances that you take at a particular time. Don't get sucked into doing work for free for other people. And take a wide range of classes. Get a lot of different perspectives, especially at a school like that where you have the opportunity to study with a lot of different people. I would take advantage of that. To Il Shmuel, Epictetus was a slave. Early Christians were oppressed. I've heard there's connections between Stoicism and early Christianity. Can you talk about whether or not was intended for the downtrodden? So that's kind of like the take that somebody like Nietzsche has, and really, people like Gibbon as well. These Enlightenment historians who actually do pretty bad history. Stoicism kind of ranges the gamut. Zeno was down on his luck. Zeno actually advised the king of Macedon, who's one of the successor kingdoms from Alexander's time, and sent some of his students there. Cicero, not a Stoic himself, but certainly interested in Stoicism. Cato, definitely a Stoic. Marcus Aurelius, of course, Seneca. I mean, this notion that Stoicism was like something that the downtrodden took refuge in, and that's why they came up with the philosophy, just historically unfounded. And I think the same thing can be said about Christianity. People in the early church came from all different walks of life. All you got to do is, look at the Book of Acts. And very early on, we see, plenty of poor people, but also plenty of intellectuals in the church. So I've never bought that line, in part because it's so oversimplifying. So usually, just sort of a remark about history of ideas. Usually, anytime that somebody's selling you a line that this philosophy just came from this, and they've got some sort of story that they're selling and some axe to grind. It almost never, when we look at the documents, turns out to be true. Assad asks, what are your thoughts on Alfred North Whitehead? Somebody I wish I had the time to actually read more and keep meaning to make the time to read. I read Process and Reality when I was an undergraduate and thought that it was amazing. Probably only understood about 1/10 of it, and I would love to be able to go back and spend the time with it. It's, it's interesting. So on existential comics, right, there's this like scale of difficulty that he has for philosophy, and he gives examples. And at the very top of the scale is, instead of like being highest difficulty, it's just Hegel. And I think that if anybody else deserves to like be at that spot with him, it's Whitehead. So a really interesting guy. All right, so I'm going a little bit over time, but I don't have any problem with that. Let me see what else we got here. Sevkin writes, I did dump Russell as per your recommendation, just start reading the individual dialogues. Russell was pretty biased. I did notice that after a couple hundred pages. Yeah, I mean, Russell, same thing. There's a lot of histories of philosophy which are going to be skewed in one way or another. And, like you read the Durants, right? That's a very common thing. The story of philosophy. It's a great tale, but you're getting a vision that goes one way or the other. Or, one that was very popular in the 19th century, Wilhelm Windelband's History of Philosophy. It's not bad. Or think about Hegel. Boy, I wouldn't rely on Hegel's History of Philosophy either. It's really cool to read for Hegel and see what he's making of people, and you might get some interesting insights, but it's not really that close. So this is why we like people like, say, Cobblestone, who although Cobblestone can be bad on some people as well, they're at least like sticking closer to the text and not trying to do quite so much. Chad asks a really interesting question. Would you consider doing a philosophical breakdown on some of Philip K. Dick's work? His central theme is essentially, what is reality? That's one of his essential themes. What is human is another one. Yeah. So I actually do have one lecture that I did in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series on Philip K. Dick. That's a series I'm doing here locally, partnering with the library. We're actually doing Octavia Butler this month and her Xenogenesis series. And I did Dick, last year. He was one of my favorite authors. He is one of my guilty pleasures. When I have the time, I go over to the local library and I check out some of his books. I've actually read everything he's written at this point, but I love just going back and rereading the stuff. Long-term goals that I've always wanted to do, and I don't know if it's ever going to happen. This might be something I should crowdfund, actually, is to write a book through Philip K. Dick's works and all of the references to different philosophical, theological, or psychological concepts. Say what those are and say what Dick is actually doing with them, because sometimes he brings them in and he has his characters like get them wrong and then another character correct them or do something, interpreting them and going further with it. So yeah, that's one thing. I've actually also I've thought about creating an online course, like in the Reason IO Teachable Academy. We focus specifically on Philip K. Dick works and talking about philosophy through that. So I that is all a matter of finding the time to do it, though. So, so here's actually kind of a timely thing, and I can't read Cyrillic, so I'm sure I'm mangling the name. Aura, perhaps. How to donate some money in order to support your channel. I'll actually put the link here. You can go to Patreon, and it's just patreon.com/Sadler. That is what people can use to support And I'm very happy for anybody who does that because it helps me actually earn a living doing what I like. Now, here's the question before that. What can you tell about a logical positivism and the truth deflation theory? So logical positivism was a movement that was quite popular in England and certain parts of Europe. And then it became popular here in the United States too for a while. And the idea was that there were two really important aspects to it. Let me backtrack. Three important aspects. One was the idea that the philosophy was supposed to be sort of an ancillary to science, to positive knowledge. That's the positivism in it, which was coming out of the 19th century with Spencer and Comte and people like that. References to what does the empirical research tell us, and philosophy should essentially, clarify what scientists are doing and get its nose out of things where it's not really scientific, like religion, ethics, things along those lines. The other thing that got connected with that was first verification and then falsification as being tests for whether statements were meaningful. And then, boy, what was the third thing? The distinction between empirical or verifiable statements, falsifiable statements, and merely analytic or tautological statements. That was also part of it. And so it was connected with philosophy of language, and it doesn't have a lot of adherence today, in part because there are some real problems with it. But you still see people adopting stances similar to it around. Do you have any thoughts on Rousseau's claim that festivals contribute to moral decay, particularly in his letter to D'Alembert, and I suppose to some degree in his first discourse? That I don't actually know, but I mean, does that seem like something that Rousseau, would have gotten some mileage out of? Perhaps. I mean, if you think about his depiction of civilized society as, essentially corrupting the human being, I think that kind of makes sense. But I haven't. I'd have to go back and take a look at the texts. How do you feel about philosophy education in high school? I'm a high school student who's gotten into philosophy. I'm disappointed to find there aren't any classes. Yeah, I think that so let me say two things. You may find classes in some high schools here in the United States. They will either invariably be Christian schools where it's a religion elective, or they will be very well-funded public schools where it will be a social studies elective. And everybody else is kind of screwed in that respect. And even if you have it there, it may not be taught very well. The other thing to say is, yeah, we really ought to have philosophy classes, and we probably never will, in part because the educational establishment has just such a lock on what gets done. So the only real way to do this is to come in from the outside, and there are organizations like Plato, just Plato, that is devoted to like bringing philosophy into schools, and we're actually trying to work on some initiatives here in the Milwaukee area for that sort of thing. Now, it would be interesting to think about online classes for. That would be something that could be quite good. That I don't know. That's worth thinking about. Kavazep asks a question: are humans intrinsically evil, or have we fallen from grace? To play on a joke from William Irvine, why not both? Well, I don't know why it has to be those as the only exclusive options. I don't think that we're intrinsically evil. I don't think that we're intrinsically good either. I mean, so many different things depending on what theology you've got. Alexei writes, Dr. Sadler, can you touch on or give an overview of the philosophy of mathematics? I don't think it becomes important until you're doing very rigorous stuff. Yeah, I haven't done anything with that for years and years and years. I was a mathematics and philosophy major back in undergrad, and but I haven't really done anything with that for a very long time. I would say it does involve questions like, well, what are numbers? There's this notion of like, Platonism, numbers are something that actually exist, or are they just, formal aspects of our language? Mill thought you could actually develop sort of an empirical approach to that. There's other things like, well, what's going on with probability? That's part of philosophy of mathematics. I'm trying to remember what are other key ideas that come up. What's going on when we're doing mathematics? But again, it's not something I've looked at for a long time. A very funny question. Thank you so much. Any thoughts on your newly found celebrity status? Well, I wouldn't say I have celebrity status. So I've been doing this now for 6 years, and I have 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Somebody can basically crap out makeup videos or cat videos or very short philosophy videos and get millions of subscribers. So I'm not exactly celebrity status. If I am, it's only in very small circles, and occasionally it leads to getting, a free beer or a coffee or something like that when I meet up with somebody, and it also leads to going to conferences and people being like, I know you from somewhere, but it's nowhere near celebrity status. So let's see here. Bruno writes, film scholar here. Any favorite films or filmmakers? Yeah, I guess you could say that, I am a fan of Ridley Scott. I mean, I'm not really a director kind of guy. I'm more like, I like this film or I like that film. Because my favorite film of all time is a Ridley Scott film. It's one of his earliest ones, The Duelists. It's got Peter Carradine, or was it Keith Carradine, the one who didn't do Kung Fu, and Harvey Keitel as these Napoleonic officers who are dueling across the entire time of the Napoleonic Wars. Just beautiful music, beautiful backgrounds, really good fighting scenes. And as a kid, I really loved The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, the 1970s version with, Peter York as D'Artagnan and, Faye Dunaway as Milady de Winter. And so I think you can see a theme there of I like daring do and swordplay. What have I seen that I've been really impressed by lately? It's hard to say, I don't do that much stuff with film. I used to show some some movies in philosophy classes, like I used Exorcism of Emily Rose in philosophy of religion, and Dark City and Memento in intro classes. A long time since I've actually done that. I don't know. It's something I don't spend enough time on, quite frankly. Jesus writes, has anyone in chat referenced the dude yet? Yes, many times. All right. Oh, Bell Hazard, do you have any tips on burnout? Yes, try not to burn out. No, I think that's a great question because it's something I have to avoid myself. So this is where Stoicism can really dissociating your intentionality from the outcome and valuing what happens in terms of the outcome and just thinking in terms of doing the action itself for the good of what it is that you're doing. About a good bit, try to avoid people who are downers. Sometimes that involves, lessening or you're even cutting out their influence in your life. And, trying to do the sort of things that are going to be conducive to having a decent life. Actually, for my wife points out that I'm happier when I do play the banjo. I'm pointing over there because the banjo's over there fairly frequently. More of, because for me, music is quite important. Let's see here. Oh, Retro Gamer, you already put online course in your output. That's just not a curriculum linking the videos in some meaningful sequence. Well, actually, I have the Reason IO Academy. All you got to do is go to Teachable. let me actually. I don't have many courses there yet, but I actually do have some, and I'm going to be bringing up more fairly soon. Yeah, Teachable is where I put my and in there you actually do have a curriculum, not only linking the videos, but providing handouts, lesson pages, quizzes, all sorts of other cool resources. So that's that. Kyle asks, have you read Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin white paper? I have not. I don't know much about Bitcoin other than what my computer science friends tell me who are into it and doing stuff with it. And at this point, it looks like it's far too late to get into the game. So it's not something that I'm planning on doing anything with. So, well, it's not Reason I/O. It's all one word. Reason IO is the name of my company, and I put the link there as well. So I'll take this last question, and then I'm going to wrap up because it's actually almost half an hour past. What is the most widespread and accepted theory of causality in academic philosophy? Does everyone criticize Hume's approach to causality? That causality is not part of our empirical experience. I don't think there is any most widespread and accepted theory of causality. I don't know that there's like a consensus about that. Does everybody criticize Hume's approach? No. I mean, there's nothing that everybody in philosophy does. Particular area, that's one of the things about philosophy. You can usually find a number of people adopting a number of different perspectives. So, yeah, that's not a easy one to answer. So I'll end on this one then, because it's not great to end on it not being able to give an answer. This is from TJF. Hey, Dr. S, wonderful work. Any tips you can give to prospective grad students in philosophy? I'm actually in the process of applying to graduate schools throughout December and early January. Yeah, when you go in, try, this is sort of along the same advice I was giving to the student who's going to University of Toronto. Try to take as wide a range of classes as possible, don't get suckered into doing all sorts of extra work for somebody for free. And, definitely don't burn any bridges based on ideological differences that you may not be holding 3 years down the line. Your job as a graduate student is essentially to learn as much as you can, not to have the answers on anything, not to produce wonderful, publishable papers, certainly not at a master's level. It's about as you can, because that's the one time in your life that you actually get the opportunity to be a student and to study and to not have to you might have to do some teaching, but you won't be teaching as much as a professor would, or hustling or whatever else that you got to do. So I'm going to wish everybody here a great rest of December. I will be doing another one of these on my Facebook page later on in December. I do, one, Facebook. So I've got to get to some work, some grading, and some other things. And I hope all of you have a great weekend.